Part 2. How White People Lost Their Rhythm. 5. A Rhythmless Nation. In its formal definitions, America has always been a rhythmless nation, and good Americans have never been able to dance. Indeed, one of the first accomplishments of the original settlers from Europe was to stop themselves from dancing. The Puritan Pilgrims left England in large part because it was full of people who used their bodies for pleasure. Next only to fornication, the most sinful use of one's body was to move in sensual and playful ways. In 1583, the Puritan writer Philip Stubbles had this to say about dancing: "If you would have your son soft, womanish, unclean, smooth mouth, affected to bawdy, scurrility, filthy rhymes, and unseemly talking. Briefly, if you would have him, as it were, transnatured into a woman, or worse, and inclined to all kinds of whoredom and abomination, set him to dancing school and to learn music, and then you shall not fail of your purpose. And if you would have your daughter riggish, bawdry, and unclean, and a filthy speaker and such like, bring her up in music and dancing, and my life for yours. You have won the goal." Another leading Puritan thinker, William Prynne, in 1632, denounced all mixed, effeminate, lascivious, amorous dancing as utterly unlawful to Christians, to chaste and sober persons, as sundry councils, fathers, modern Christian with ancient pagan authors and nations have resolved. Though it be now so much in use, in fashion and request among us, that many spend more hours, more days and nights, in dancing than in praying, I might add working too. So once in America, where they had the opportunity to create a perfect world, the Puritans set out to lock bodily movements to the rules of God. In 1635, John Cotton, one of the principal ministers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, declared that the new land should forbid lascivious dancing to wanton ditties and amorous gestures and wanton dalliances, which I would bear witness against as a great flabella libidinus, fanning of sexual desire. In that same year, Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, saw in the dances of the Indians a near and dangerous temptation. For after once being in their houses and beholding what their worship was, I durst never be an eye-witness, lest I should have been a partake of Satan's inventions and worships, contrary to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 14. Early in their adventure, the Puritan Pilgrims had to deal with what was perhaps the most renegade act in American history. In 1625, an Englishman named Thomas Morton organized a non-Puritan settlement, Marymount, north of Plymouth, at the present site of Quincy, Massachusetts. By many accounts, Marymount was everything the Puritans feared. Whiskey and beer flowed freely, and whites and Indians cavorted, copulated, and danced wildly around a maypole, a pagan invention that had become the symbol of fun and leisure in villages across England. Morton later recalled that the inhabitants of Marymount did devise amongst themselves revels and merriment after the old English customer. They prepared to set up a maypole upon the festival day, and therefore brewed a barrel of excellent beer, to be spent with other good cheer, for all comers of that day. And upon May Day, a pagan festival welcoming summer, they brought the maypole to the place appointed with drums, guns, pistols, and other fitting instruments for the purpose, and there erected it with the help of savages that came thither to see the manner of our revels. Puritan governments had banned the maypole and May Day festivals in England, and their brethren in the New World did the same. But Marymount's population grew at an alarming rate, and so, in 1628, the Pilgrims in nearby Plymouth County dispatched Captain Miles Standish and an armed force to destroy their libertine competitors. Morton was nearly killed in the assault, then hauled into a Plymouth court and deported back to England. The Maypole was chopped down and burned. Shortly thereafter, New England authorities made it illegal for men and women to touch each other while dancing, and many towns in the 17th century outlawed organized dances. In fact, writes Bruce C. Daniels, a historian of early American leisure, virtually no organized dances or mixed-sex dancing took place in the first generation of New England's settlements. But ministerial wrath and legal punishment did not eliminate dancing. People did it privately, inside their houses, or away in the woods. And then the French came. In the 1670s, migrants from the land of decadence arrived in New England, bringing with them expertise in decidedly lascivious movements. Worse yet, they opened schools in which they taught colonists dances that simulated carnal acts. When the authorities became aware of one of these schools of vice, they shut it down and prosecuted the proprietor. But the French dance schools continued to appear throughout the colonies. In 1684, Increase Mather set out to put an end to this with a precisely titled book, An Arrow Against Profane and Promiscuous Dancing, drawn out of the quiver of the Scriptures. Not all dancing was bad, said Mather. It was perfectly appropriate, where men vault in their armor to spew their strength and activity, or when it was sober and grave dancing of men with men or of women with women. Mather did not anticipate later problems with same-sex dancing. But mixed or promiscuous dancing, such as the kind he saw performed at a frolic, reveling feast, and a ball, which discovers their corruption, or which he observed at wanton bacchanalian Christmases, had become customary among Christians and cannot be thought on without horror. Mather counseled governmental authorities to declare such dancing to be utterly unlawful, and that it cannot be tolerated in such a place as New England without great sin, defining exactly what constituted the unchaste touches and gesticulations used by dancers that had a palpable tendency to that which is evil, was a challenge. Certainly, any dancing in which a man and a woman touched each other was evil, but what kind of bodily movement led one to hell? Mather called it mincing, which biblical authorities had defined as a rapid and repeated swaying of the body. It was, according to Martin Luther, a wag or waggle, resembling the affected gait of coquettish females. It was feminine, unpredictable, and sexual. It was authored by Satan and embodied in women. It was rhythm. Many Americans continued to dance, but official America did not. William Penn, the founder of the province of Pennsylvania, attacked pleasure generally and dancing specifically in his treatises The Frame of Government, 1682, and No Crown, No Cross, 1697, which are widely considered to be the blueprints for the Constitution and, according to the eminent historian Bernard Bailyn, could hardly have been more clearly fundamental, more manifestly constituent in nature, to the American national system. In The Frame of Government, Penn insists that stage plays, cards, dice, May games, masks, revels, bull baitings, which incite people to rudeness, cruelty, looseness, and irreligion, shall be respectively discouraged and severely punished. In No Crown, No Cross, Penn reprints lengthy early Christian sermons arguing that dancing is the devil's procession, and he that entereth into a dance entereth into his procession. The devil is the guide, the middle, and the end of the dance. As many paces as man maketh in dancing, so many paces both he makes to go to hell. In 1700, Increase Mather's son, Cotton, who more than anyone defined Puritan America, responded to the continued spread of formal dances and dance schools with his own published attack, A Cloud of Witness Against Balls and Dances, in which he called for an end to the dance craze as it now prevails, and especially in balls, or in circumstances that lead the young people of both sexes into great liberties with one another. A few decades later, George Whitefield, the leader of the Great Awakening, which according to many historians laid the self-disciplining moral groundwork for the American Revolution, believed that dancing and music were devilish diversions, and demanded that the people shun them. One night during a preaching tour of South Carolina in 1740, Whitefield attempted to convert an entire tavern full of dancers. I had not come to be their guest that night, for it being New Year's Day, several of the neighbors were met together to divert themselves by dancing country dances. By the advice of my companions, I went in amongst them, while a woman was dancing a jig. At my first entrance, I endeavored to spew the folly of such entertainments, and to convince her how well pleased the devil was at every step she took. For some time she endeavored to outbrave me. Neither the fiddler nor she desisted, but at last she gave over, and the musician laid aside his instrument. Christ triumphed over Satan. All were soon put to silence. Those who heeded Whitefield's admonitions were more likely to adopt the kind of discipline that the Founding Fathers would soon promote. But not all the preacher's converts remained converted. Some were as bent on their pleasure that, notwithstanding all that had been said, after I had gone to bed, I heard their music and dancing. Whitefield's sermons against dancing achieved similarly mixed and comical results a few months later in Philadelphia. A local newspaper reported, "Since Mr. Whitefield's preaching here, the dancing school, assembly, and concert rooms have been shut up, as inconsistent with the doctrine of the gospel, and though the gentlemen concerned caused the door to be broken open again, we are informed that no company came last assembly night." Whitefield was more successful in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where, according to one observer after his visit in 1740, music and dancing seems to be wholly laid aside. Where you might formerly have heard jovial and, it may be, profane and obscene songs, you may now hear psalms and hymns of praise sung to God and to our Lord Jesus Christ. White people, the farthest from civilization, were the most likely to dance without shame, such as the inferior sort of Scottish settlers in back-country North Carolina observed by an upper-class traveler in 1729. Dancing they are all fond of, especially when they can get a fiddle or bagpipe. At this they will continue hours together. Nay, so attached are they to this darling amusement that if they can't procure music, they will sing for themselves, music and musical instruments being very scarce in Carolina. When touring villages in remote parts of South Carolina, George Whitefield despaired to find that in every little town there is a settled dancing master, but scarcely anywhere a settled minister to be met with. Such a proceeding must be of dreadful consequences to any, especially a new settled province. All governors, if it were only from a policy of human policy, ought to put a stop to it. For such entertainments altogether enervate the minds of people, insensibly leading them into effeminacy, and unfitting them to endure those hardships and fatigues which must necessarily be undergone to bring any province to perfection. True religion exalts a nation. Such sinful entertainments are a reproach, and will, in time, be the ruin of any people. The minister Joseph Bellamy of Connecticut, another leader of the Great Awakening, and one of the Founding Fathers' principal clerical allies, preached against the pernicious and ensnaring practice of dancing. Before the Revolution, he warned of dancing as a school of debauchery and corruption that tends to promote an idle and dissolute course of life, and gives the mind a relish for nothing but carnal and sensual pleasures. Bellamy preached a lesson the founders well understood. that dancing, like sensual pleasure generally, made the people so very vain and extravagant and ungovernable. When colonists fell under the spell of primitive gyrations, their leaders were quick to discipline them. A member of James Oglethorpe's 1733 expedition recounted that an hour after they landed at what would become the city of Savannah, Georgia, the native residents welcomed the newcomers by dancing round a large fire, which they made upon the ground. Some of the Englishmen were mildly disgusted by the Indians. Many antic gestures, singing and beating time with their feet and hands to admiration. Others were enthralled, and one went native. One of the oldest of our people, Dr. Sims, having slipped away from our camp and got a little in drink, found his way up to the Indian town and joined with the Indians in their dancing, endeavoring to mimic and ape them in their antic gestures, which I, being informed of, sent for him and desired that he would immediately repair home to our camp. Otherwise, I assured him I would acquaint Mr. Oglethorpe with his folly. He promised me that he would. But being so much in liquor, he returned again to the Indians and danced with them as before, which being told to me, I ordered several white men, who were there to carry him home by force, it being of a very bad consequence that the Indians should see any follies or indiscretions in our old men, by which they judge that our young men must be still guilty of greater, for they measure man's understanding and judgment according to their years. Another member of Oglethorpe's party echoed what other settlers had said before, that the Indian dancers were similar to the Morris dancers in England. Morris dancing was a folk dance, possibly derived from dances performed by Moors from North Africa, involving rhythmic stepping with bent knees and elbows, moves not unlike the dances of Native Americans and American slaves. It was attacked by Puritans in England and banned in the New England colonies. German settlers were similarly split over primitive and libidinal dancing. At a ball celebrating the signing of a treaty between European settlers and the tribes of the Six Nations at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in 1744, the leader of the delegation of settlers was dismayed to see a number of German women who danced in wilder time than any Indians. The females, I dare not call them ladies, were in general very disagreeable. In the 1750s, in the German town of Bethany, in the Georgia frontier, the wife of the local schoolmaster was publicly censured and her husband dismissed from his position after she conceived a lust to dance, and actually did dance, to the sounds of a dulcimer. Nonetheless, many white colonists, especially in the South, continued to be inspired by the movements of Indians and slaves. In 1759, a clergyman of the Church of England was disturbed by the disorderly, black-inspired ways in which whites in Virginia amused themselves. They are immoderately fond of dancing, and indeed, it is almost the only amusement they partake of. But even in this they discover great want of taste and elegance, and seldom appear with that gracefulness and ease which these movements are so calculated to display. Towards the close of an evening, when the company are pretty well tired with country dances, it is usual to dance jigs, a practice originally borrowed, I am informed, from the Negroes. These dances are without any method or regularity. A gentleman and lady stand up and dance about the room, one of them retiring, the other pursuing, then perhaps meeting in an irregular, fantastical manner. Another English traveler in Virginia, Nicholas Creswell, noted the same phenomena in 1775, and with the same disdain. Last night I went to the ball. Here was about 37 ladies dressed and powdered to the life, some of them very handsome and as much vanity as is necessary. All of them fond of dancing, but I do not think they perform it with the greatest elegance. Betwixt the country dances they have what I call everlasting jigs. A couple gets up and begins to dance a jig, to some Negro tune. Others comes, and cuts them out, and these dances last as long as the fiddler can play. This is sociable, but I think it looks more like a bacchanalian dance than one in polite assembly. One Virginian who loved detestable dancing was Thomas Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph, who, according to one of the family's slaves, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle and dance half the night. This was in contrast to Thomas, who, according to one biographer, seemed not the least bit curious about or interested in the music of his or any other slaves. Several scholars believe that Randolph, rather than his brother, was the father of the child born to the family's slave, Sally Hemings. There were even some bands of extreme renegade dancers among the white people of colonial America. In 1779, the Independent Chronicle of Boston reported on a sect in nearby Pepperell, who, under the idea of religion, dance stark naked, etc. It proves indeed that men will be guilty of great extravagances when urged by a misguided conscience and enthusiastic zeal. And then there were the Shakers of western Massachusetts, who, for a time during the American Revolution, reportedly disclaimed the use of any kind of garment when engaged in their religious exercises, presenting themselves unpolluted by the vain and unchristian articles of dress, and performing all their dancing, turnings, jumpings, tumblings, twistings, and wrigglings in that condition. Mind the music and the step. The founders of the United States learned from their intellectual forefather, John Locke, that children should be taught to dance only in a way that gives graceful motions all the life, and above all things, manliness. According to Locke, dance teachers should eliminate apish, affected postures and the jigging part that leads children away from perfect, graceful carriage. More importantly, the Founding Fathers feared that sensual amusements would undermine the discipline necessary for a republic of self-governing individuals. John Adams argued that the pleasure culture of cities helped create the motley rabble that instigated the Boston Massacre. Nothing was more subversive of order than animalistic lack of control, which certain types of dancing suggested. When he heard that his sister and her husband had changed their minds and would not send their children to dancing school, Adams exulted. "What a sudden and entire conversion is this! It is from vanity to wisdom, from foppery to sobriety and solidity," he wrote. "I never knew a good dancer good for anything else. Of the men who danced well, they gained neither sense or learning or virtue for it." But rather than ban such amusements as dancing, or fencing, or music, Adams wrote that Americans should be ignorant of 'em all than fond of any one of 'em. He was appalled by the gyrations of a white man named Zab Hayward he saw dancing in a tavern with a rabble and Negroes with a fiddle. He has had the reputation for at least 15 years of the best dancer in the world in these towns. Several attempted, but none could equal him in nimbleness of heels. But he has no conception of the grace, the air, nor the regularity of dancing. His air is absurd and wild, desultory and irregular, and his countenance is low and ignoble. In short, the air of his countenance, the motions of his body, hands, and head are extremely silly and affected and mean. Some of the Founding Fathers were torn between their private love of sensual pleasure and their public commitment against it. Adams's colleague, Josiah Quincy II, who authored several of the most important pro-independence tracts, confided to his journal that he had attended several comedy dance performances while visiting New York and was, upon the whole, much gratified. Moreover, if I had stayed in town a month, I should go to the theater every acting night. But, as a citizen and a friend of the morals and happiness of society, I should strive hard against the admission and much more the establishment of a playhouse in any state of which I was a member. Benjamin Latrobe, the father of American architecture who designed the U.S. Capitol, saw whites performing the Virginia Jig and called it the excess of detestability. A cousin of John Quincy Adams, Elizabeth Cranch, wrote of her love for dancing and her fear of the wrath of her cousin, who was monstrously severe upon the follies of mankind. Given the founder's feelings on the matter, it seems reasonable to conclude that the Continental Congress's 1774 declaration to discourage every species of extravagance and dissipation, which was widely interpreted as including sensual dancing, formally established the American citizen as rhythmless. As the historian Bruce Daniels puts it, Puritan asceticism found a new voice in the guise of Republican simplicity. One of the better-known Americans to have lost his groove during the Revolution was Yankee Doodle. Very few Americans know that this national icon was born a renegade. The term Yankee was invented by British soldiers in the 17th century as an epithet against bawdy Dutch pirates in the West Indies. The first recorded use of the term in the American colonies was the listing of a South Carolina slave named Yankee in 1725. The British then used it in derisive reference to the undisciplined and licentious bumpkins of New England. During the first skirmishes of the War of Independence, British soldiers sang a song about a macaroni, slang for an ostentatious, hedonistic dandy who went to town to find the girls with whom he was quite handy. The character's surname, Doodle, was then a vernacular term meaning simpleton, fool, or penis. To emphasize their point, the British often danced mock jigs to the song. Unfortunately, during the war, many Americans agreed with their enemies that this characterization was an insult rather than a compliment. And so they turned Yankee Doodle from a renegade into a soldier. Fife and drum units in colonial militias added a heavy, regimented da-dum-da-dum beat, free of irregular syncopation, and transformed the dance song into a march. New lyrics instructed soldiers to mind the music and the step, and saluted Captain Washington, who sat the world along in rows, in hundreds, and in millions. Following in line, dance schools during the Revolution began to advertise themselves as teaching only the genteelest dances. John Griffiths, the most influential dancing instructor of the early national period, taught classes throughout New York and New England, and wrote a widely read manual that listed influences of ill manners to be carefully avoided by youth of both sexes. Among these were swinging the arms and all other awkward gestures, drumming with feet or hands in company, all actions that have the most remote tendency to indelicacy. All instances of that ill-judged familiarity which breeds contempt, and everything which may be called sluttish or slovenly. In the 18th century, the only folk dance deemed respectable was the contra dance, in which the movements were confined to walking stiffly in prearranged patterns with no motion of the hips. The Marquis de Choiseul, a French general serving with the Americans, noticed considerable regimentation at formal balls in Philadelphia. Dancing is said to be the emblem both of gaiety and love. Here it seems to be the emblem of legislation and of marriage. Of legislation, inasmuch as places are marked out, the contra dance is prescribed, and every proceeding provided for, calculated, and submitted to regulation. Of marriage, since each lady is supplied with a partner with whom she must dance the whole evening without being allowed to take another. All the dances are previously arranged, and the dancers are called each in their turn. Revolutionary-era balls were ruled by managers. Choiseul was acquainted with one manager of whom it was said that when a young lady was figuring in a square dance, forgot her turn because she was conversing with a friend, he came up to her and loudly called out, "Come, come, watch what you are doing. Do you think you are here for pleasure?" This is not to suggest that the national effort to regulate bodily movement was entirely successful. One of Washington's soldiers reported in his journal that, at the end of the epic winter of 1778, the Continental troops, camped at Valley Forge, celebrated with a renewal of an ancient renegade tradition. May 1st, last evening. Maypoles were erected in every regiment, in the camp, and at the reveille. I was awoke by 3 cheers, in honor of King Tammy, a 17th-century chief, in the Lenni Lenape nation of the Delaware Valley. The day was spent in mirth and jollity, the soldiers parading, marching with fife and drum, and huzzahing as they passed the poles, their hats adorned with white blossoms. The following was the procession of the 3rd J Regiment on the aforesaid day. First, one sergeant dressed in an Indian habit representing King Tammany. Second, 13 sergeants dressed in white, each with a bow in his left hand and 13 arrows in his right. Having gone native, the soldiers were abruptly brought back to civilization by Washington himself. The non-commissioned officers and soldiers, being drawn up in the aforesaid manner on the regimental parade, gave 3 cheers at their own pole, and then marched off to headquarters to do honor to His Excellency. But just as they were descending the hill to the house, an aide met them and informed them that the general was indisposed and desired them to retire, which they did with the greatest decency and regularity. Even commissioned officers in Washington's army were known to break the new rules. A group of high-ranking officers who occupied a Loyalist's mansion in New Jersey were seen dancing reels with some tawdry-dressed females. But when patriotic Americans danced in any way that exhibited an earthy sensuality, they did so knowing that it was against the national interest. This may account for why so many patriots danced so poorly. By the 19th century, as we have seen, some slaves expressed pity for white people's lack of rhythm. Others were amused. There are several accounts of slaves mocking the movements of whites, such as a newspaper report on a party held by slaves near Charleston in 1772. The entertainment at the event was men copying or taking off the manner of their masters, and the women those of their mistresses, and relating some highly curious anecdotes to the inexpressible diversion of the company. One ex-slave recalled, "Us slaves watched white folks' parties where the guests danced a minuet and then paraded in a grand march, with the ladies and gentlemen going different ways and then meeting again, arm in arm, and marching down the center together. Then we'd do it too, but we used to mock 'em every step. Sometimes the white folks noticed it, but they seemed to like it. I guess they thought we couldn't dance any better."